Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Scaling Agile, SAFe 4.0 and CMMI, Deliver Hardened Large-Scale Agile by Tom Cagley. We're excited you're able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars offered by IIST. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Defect Prevention, a Tester's Role in Process Improvement and Reducing the Cost of Poor Quality by Mike Ennis on March 10th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to testinginstitute.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at testinginstitute.com. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Tom Cagley. Tom?
Thank you very much, Eric. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Really all depends, right? We live in a world that is just, it is time zone independent almost. And that's why these webinars, both in terms of live and recorded, are so important as information vehicles. SAFe 4.0, CMMI, those two things, when you immediately throw them on a slide, they almost feel like they should be odd partners, that they pull against each other. That sort of agile feeling, and CMMI, which in the past has had sort of a very overbearing kind of feeling. So strange bedfellows perhaps, but let's see whether or not that's true. If we go back in time, many would argue that the CMMI is perceived as that last bastion of discipline and control. Those words, discipline and control, often, especially coupled with the CMMI, often elicit a bad feeling. However, anyone that's played sports recognizes the role that discipline is, has in terms of supporting innovation and creativity. Great basketball teams, whether it's the Cleveland Cavaliers or the Golden State Warriors or some of the other teams that you might know, the ones that are at the top of their game doing these great, these incredible feats of athletics, all are very disciplined and control. And as soon as they fall out of discipline and control, you see all sorts of crazy stuff happening on and off the court. So discipline and control really aren't, the alternates of being agile and being innovative. It really is a matter of having an ability to have a set of constraints that allow us to know what area that we can actually take this behavior and apply it. As a quick review, there are a number of different versions of the CMMI. I'm going to focus perhaps on CMMI for development for just a quick second. The CMMI, for those of you who grew up and weren't influenced by it or didn't read about it or haven't participated in an organization that leverages it, and I think that's probably down to 5 people on the call at this point, recognize it is a model. In its stage format, it has 5 maturity models, 25 process areas that describe a wide array of capabilities, and those, they really extend past that core of software development that many of us know from from when we were either coding or testing, or perhaps even when we were doing things like project management. So parts of this model talk about not only organizational training, but how we deal with organizational innovation and deployment. Again, areas that are more than just coding and testing kinds of scenarios. But let's face it, arguably the CMMI and as someone who actually works in that world to an extent, may have hit its heyday, 5 or 10 years ago, even though arguably there are still substantial numbers of people being trained. There are still substantial numbers of assessments being done across the world. Matter of fact, last year there were more assessments done than any other time before. So, but along comes Agile, and we run into having sort of wild nights. And there was a perception, especially when Agile was young, that it really was just that. It was all about doing whatever we wanted to do. Never really was that, right? And if you spent time with the Agile Manifesto, and you spent time with the values, and you spent time with the principles, you'd know that there was a substantial amount of discipline there. So Agile in reality, not really wild nights, right? It was a vision of a lean, lightweight approach to software development, very focused on trying to get work from an idea into a production environment so that people then can use things like feedback loops to know what really was happening. We would take projects, then many of them I would be involved in back a number of years ago, that were 5 and 6 years long, and people wouldn't see anything in production until the end of that 5th or 6th year. And then they'd be surprised. And of course we would be surprised that what they'd asked for 5 or 6 years ago, perhaps even longer than that, wasn't exactly what they needed anymore. So we had some of this perception that suddenly doing these small bits of work and focusing and replanning and doing those kinds of things, that perception caused that whole idea that it wasn't disciplined, it wasn't constrained, it wasn't focused on delivering business results. But the Agile Manifesto really, as another quick reminder, didn't abrogate the idea of discipline. What it basically said, right, and I like this graphic from Dr. David Rico, that we would focus on things, and we valued customer collaboration more than we valued contracts. Didn't mean we didn't do any of those things, and you get these arguments that because we didn't value it as highly, then of course you didn't have to do it. We would build working software. We would use that as a mechanism to have a lot of conversations, to get and gather feedback so that we would have high quality and high value kinds of work versus building large pieces of documentation. I remember, if I go back to one of the first requirements documents that I ever worked on, and again, it was in the 1990s kind of area, and that document for a credit card processing system was several thousand pages thick. Now, arguably, we built the system, it ran, but I'm not sure that we did all of those requirements. Because, very frankly, even though we were doing waterfall development, even though we were a CMMI level 4 shop and had all sorts of wonderful traceability metrics, things changed over the life of that. Agile, the Agile Manifesto, the values really did talk about discipline, and we had to step back and say, what is it that really is important? And again, I go through these and I talk about the discipline that Agile, whether it's Scrum, Extreme, Scrumban, or some of the other methods have, and then the discipline of the CMMI, because those two things really are important. But most Agile, especially early on, was a focus on the team level participation. There was another perception that Agile didn't scale, that there was a lot of danger in terms of scaling things up so that we could actually deal with large projects. Now, team level Agile, we talk about Extreme, and Extreme might have team sizes, 10, 15 people kind of thing. Scrum talks about 5 to 9. Again, these are relatively small teams. Of course, you could do something very large with a very small team. It just might take you a few decades. We had to figure out how to scale. We had to how to deal with other teams when we were using these things called backlogs, where we were doing demos, we were doing retrospectives, those sorts of things. How we had then to deal with things like support teams, things like DevOps that we talk about in Agile today. We also had to start having a discussion, especially with big things, that we really weren't doing projects. What we're dealing with is building products. And products go on for a lot longer than any individual project. So all of this discussion, because it wasn't part of the early discussion of Scrum or maybe Crystal or some of the other very early instantiations of Agile, caused people to say, you know what, danger, Will Robinson, because we can't scale this stuff. There was that wonderful perception. Obviously, as soon as we recognized, and there is all sorts of wonderful data that does suggest that Agile is higher quality, and it is to some extent faster, and that people are significantly happier. Lots of data in terms of that. There's also data that suggests it's not. But once we got to a point of saying, you know what, we really do, we can, and we'd like to try to find a mechanism for scaling this stuff up, out came what I would call the giants, right? Some people, if you catch them in an unguarded moment at an Agile conference, might call them the 4 horses of the apocalypse, but things like LESS, things like DAD, Disciplined Agile Development, things like DSDM from Europe, and obviously the Scaled Agile Framework Enterprise, which we're really here to talk about today, were scaling mechanisms, right? In terms of how do we use Agile? How do we use this interesting thing that was first postulated at the team level? How do we do that with multiple teams? How do we scale that up? I will suggest to you, and I was interestingly enough having this conversation with Dr. Hanna beforehand, that SAFE is currently, Scaled Agile Framework Enterprise, is currently the #1 mechanism for actually scaling Agile up. The rest of these, I would suggest, are very valuable. Used many of them before, but let's use SAFE as sort of our metaphor that takes us down this path. And before we get there, let's talk about this whole paradigm of agility and process discipline. And we've done a lot of mapping in between the two and looking and taking industry surveys to try to get a handle on the whole idea of process burden and agility, right? So if we think about these 4 quadrants, we have low, up in the upper left-hand corner, we have low process discipline but high agility. Things like team-level Scrum, which really are a focus on trying to remove process discipline. Very lean, very focused on getting work from the beginning, from the backlog that's accepted into the team, to production by the end of that. And then you could also suggest that you have low agility, especially from the point of view of actually delivering anything, with very low process burden with something called ad hoc agile. And that's just you do whatever you feel like doing kind of stuff. You have very low agility at the same time in the bottom right-hand corner of what I call classic death by process CMMI, circa the late 1990s and the early 2000s, that were based on, I would suggest, a misperception about the way CMMI had to be applied, and that every process had to have a process manual and at least 400 pages of documentation. And that 400 pages obviously is a bit of hyperbole, but in reality, we look at things like LESS, SAFe, DAD, and DSDM. They have a high degree of process discipline. All of them have processes. Arguably, Scrum is a process framework also, but these leverage Scrum, Kanban, all of the other tools, in essence, to say you workflows from this point at the beginning, that backlog, to the end. And so we can see that happening, and that there are checkpoints, there are individuals that help challenge and take people through the process. Again, SAFe is a mechanism that builds not only on this whole idea of agility and the Agile Manifesto, but leverages a combination of things and layers in the principles of Lean in terms of how it then modifies the overall Agile principles. So it comes up with 9 basic principles. And these augment the 12 basic principles that you see in the Agile Manifesto. But the important ones, and I'd suggest that early on, as you consider things like SAFe, things like taking an economic view are a massive step forward in terms of ensuring that everyone that's actively involved in delivery is thinking about not only how I'll code a piece of work or how I'll test a piece of work or those sorts of things, but what is it that's being delivered and how can we deliver that so that it has the maximum economic point of view. So we use techniques like weighted shortest job first so that we know what to start with. So it's a fundamentally, I think, more disciplined way of looking at work than just, hey, we'll all get together and prioritize the backlog. Or maybe we'll do grooming and we'll get the 3 amigos together and we'll do that. Now in this case we're going to actually start at the portfolio level and drive that down, because very frankly it's the health of the organization in the end that makes sure everybody gets paid. So we have a combination of Agile principles, and there are 12 of them, and these Lean, SAFe, Lean, Agile principles that help us to interpret our basic kinds of Agile constructs. Things like visualizing and limit WIP. For those of you who've been used things like Kanban, you'll immediately recognize that as a Lean principle and how it gives you the availability of actually controlling the flow and identifying bottlenecks and constraints. SAFe 4.0 is, and I strongly recommend SAFe 4.0, if nothing else, as a mechanism to understand all of the component parts that are important to taking work at a large scale and driving it forward. I had a conversation the other day with somebody who was enamored with SAFe 4.0, but wanted to do this with 2 teams of roughly 7 people on a team. SAFe has a lot of overhead to it and is scaled for 50 to 250 people, lots of different teams involved with that. So what we see is different layers within it. We start at the portfolio level, all the way up at the top of the sheet, and work gets prioritized. You decide from using an economic point of view which pieces of work need to be done. What are these big things that we need to do to make this organization more profitable, meet its goals, those sorts of things. That then translates into value streams, and work focuses. You have teams that are dedicated to these value streams, and they focus on delivering all of that work. And across those value streams are release trains that take what we might call at a different time programs and drive those through. They might hold together and focus on multiple program increments, PIs, across 90 days or longer, and then replan again and again as they move forward. That budgets and thinks about work as a product, not as individual projects that start and stop. We might replan, we might do releases on some formal schedule, but at any point, because we're leveraging all the way down here at the bottom, the ideas from Scrum, the ideas from Scrumban, the ideas from extreme programming, we know that we're delivering work in short increments that could be delivered when it's called for. The word that typically, or the phrase that typically gets used is we work on cadence, right? We're doing 2 weeks, whatever the cadence is of the teams. They're synchronized. They start at the same time, they end at the same time across the entirety of the release train, 50 to 250 people, lots of different teams. They start and stop at the same time. They all plan together, but when the business needs the work to be released, we can call for release at any time. Develop on cadence, release on demand kind of thing. So these 4 levels, starting at the portfolio, uses things like Kanban all the way up the top. The value stream level, which is the level right below portfolio, starts to group release trains, individual groups of teams, to provide larger solutions. It's one of the newer things in SAFe 4.0, to provide, so that they're related, they keep in contract. We then break down into the program level, where work then starts to get farmed out into different silos, into different teams. But again, because it's being coordinated across a train, you're doing the planning all together. You're doing your demonstrations all together at the release train level. All of that stuff can stay consolidated, can stay constrained, kind of thing. You're starting to see that SAFe, once we get into a large scale, once we start to get into a lot of different people, we have almost a requirement, or almost an extreme need, to actually have more discipline directly called out. CMMI is one of those mechanisms that help us then work through an interpretation of SAFe that says, what, people have thought about all of these controls, and let's see whether or not we can we look at these 2 frameworks, SAFe as one form of disciplined Agile, and the CMMI as sort of a larger mechanism that has been proven to provide discipline within an organization. Can they work together? Are they overlapped? Is there a relationship that we can leverage to actually think about this? So interestingly enough, the answer is sort of. And you thought probably I was going to say the word depends. In reality, Agile is not just Scrum, and so we have to recognize that if we were just talking about Scrum, right? That there might be things that are important. Scrum is a lot about project management, project planning, project monitoring and control, and to some extent requirements management. But really, it's only half of what, well, or some proportion of what needs to get done. And therefore, we look at these larger models, like the CMMI, which talk about the technical disciplines. This allows us to take a look at the way we're practicing Agile and say, okay, what areas have we really talked about in terms of our approach to Agile? And the reality is that if we take the CMMI, we take all of the technical practices, all of the management practices, and look at it and compare it to things like SAFe, well, we got some fairly good coverage on some areas. Things like project planning. Most of that and a lot of that is actually gets called out in terms of both SAFe and Scrum-like things that many people think belong to Scrum, but actually belong to extreme programming. But if we look at that, we can say, estimating the scope of a project. Well, we at a team level, we do that. We have product backlogs, we do individual team level planning, we might do function points or snap points or planning poker. We have all sorts of ways of wrestling with that. So again, even just the project management side, Scrum, and the planning side of extreme programming, lo and behold, covers some of the more important facets that called out in the CMMI. So, I mean, arguably, right? Arguably, there are lots of overlaps, which is good because therefore it starts to tell us that these two frameworks, right, the CMMI being more of a model than truly a framework, but we can look at these two things and say, okay, if we have this sort of macro model, the CMMI, which describes sort of how an overall organization, the things that have to be covered, got to do some form of configuration management. We really do need to know where the code is and who can break it. And the SAFe, Scrum, Extreme, all of those are a framework. We can then use SAFe as a mechanism to at least understand or implement a significant portion of what's required to actually deliver functionality to the end user. So we've gone through a process of actually doing mapping all the way through the mechanism, and what we found that there are some really good relationships. And things like because SAFe inherits a lot of relationships between extreme programming, Scrum, and Kanban, and it has a lot of those technical features in there, we see that SAFe really has a lot of the the technical features that we would expect. It does a lot of the project planning pieces that we might expect. It provides controls and feedback mechanisms not only for the organization as a whole, but for the team to actually control and do what they need to do. It does have weaknesses though, right? So SAFe doesn't talk about continuous process improvement. SAFe doesn't talk about organizational training. Heck, neither does Scrum, neither does Extreme. Again, those pieces, which SAFe is sort of a mechanism to put all of those together for big things, because at the lower level, SAFe, Scrum, Extreme, those sorts of points, there are things that Agile doesn't talk about. They're not there. So the whole idea of an organization that might have a hierarchy, that might have to deal with promotions, might have to deal with giving people raise, none of that stuff is part of, is part of any Agile framework. That has to come from somewhere else. And so what we find is, just like that, there are some things that are covered very nicely, some things that I would suggest are pretty safe, things like project planning. And if we use the CMMI goals for a second, right, establish estimates, develop a project plan, obtain commitment, we can look at the 4 layers of SAFe, the portfolio level. And at that point, there are mechanisms for doing weighted shortest job first. That is an estimation. It's a budgeting mechanism, estimation and budgeting mechanism. At the value stream level, we peel it down again, and it does value stream level, estimation. It still goes back to that whole economic framework, and then starts to peel down in terms of value stream planning and road mapping. What is it that we're going to do over time? And the same thing's true, and we can peel it down layer by layer, programs, and all the way down to the team level, where we're doing program increment planning, where we're doing check-ins, those sorts of things that allow work to stay planned and synchronized, budgeted, estimated, and synchronized, so that people have an ability to say, here's where we are today, without some of the really crazy overhead that might happen, and then get us to a point where we can say, here's where we're going to be based on how fast we're moving, the level of risk that we're seeing in the future. So project planning, pretty safe. Doesn't stay that way, right? There are other areas. Things like product integration. Product integration in the CMMI has 3 goals. Prepare for product integration. Ensure that that interface compatibility. Assemble product components and deliver the product. Really substantial, important things to actually putting together large-scale software. Right? If I were building a personal web page, I still would have to deal with some degree of product integration. But if I were building and assembling a car, which is a very strange mixture, obviously, of hardware and software, if I were doing that, then product integration becomes significantly more important. But if we look at that, we see that in some cases, right, if at a portfolio level, the SAFe is even fairly mute on these kinds of topics, but we can see where, as we peel down right into the value stream, think of this as a hierarchy, portfolio being the biggest pieces, the team level dealing with things like user stories, that as we spin down, we have some mechanisms that allow us to talk about experience and get feedback from integration. Things like the demo, things like continuous builds, DevOps, SAFe, the concept of an architectural runway, being able to say, you know what, we're going to build our architecture. We're going to build that slightly ahead of the software development team so that they then can put their software and interact with it and provide feedback, use that as a feedback mechanism to the architecture. but we have those mechanisms for product integration. But you can see some of these being repeated over and over again. They're probably less directly called out, something that we would have to ensure that we're thinking about. And again, in SAFE, I'd argue that the system engineering team, those sorts of things that exist and should be called out, I think are very helpful to dealing with this, but the CMMI makes that extremely explicit, which tells us that it's probably important to make sure that we build it into our definition of done, things like that to move it forward. Unfortunately, not all things are safe at all, arguably, right? So I don't know about you, but many of the teams and organizations I work with have a lot of interaction with other suppliers, whether it's buying pieces of software and integrating it in, using open source stuff, or or integrating with groups that are outside of the organization. Might be a different firm entirely. The whole idea of creating, the idea of supplier agreement management isn't very safe, right? If we look at SAFE, we look at Scrum, we look at Extreme, we look at the basic building blocks of the Scaled Agile framework, the answer is, again, we don't see very much in terms of mechanisms for controlling and providing feedback. Now, we can argue that things like the supplier release train and having the suppliers involved in program increment planning. So those 45 to 60 day kinds of planning events, big planning events that you have that plans a big chunk of time out. Those are mechanisms, right? Those are mechanisms, but they're not directly assigned to that. So we have to think about things and how we're going to address suppliers and bringing in product and being able to control that and understand that we actually looked at the right thing and that it get tested before it went in. Those sorts of things. The CMMI, one of the features that if you were to go to an Agile conference and start to have a direct discussion about project and product quality assurance, so process and product quality assurance kinds of discussion, you may actually get in a fist fight at the bar, kind of thing. The mechanism of Agile provides a lot of its own internal oversight. So it's not, while at the team level we can see that we have things like the Scrum of Scrums that SAFE uses is a good mechanism for providing feedback as to how work is being done. That work moves from and can be integrated into the larger piece. Those sorts of things in a right cadence and at the right level of quality. There really is not a lot that calls out. How are we going to know that the right flow of work is actually being followed? Other than we're hoping that things like the definition of done and the demonstration and integrated testing and maybe doing test-driven development gets us to a point where we touch the right bases at the right time. But again, there are lots of hooks that we can use but we have to have that systematic discussion so that we understand that we want, the things that we want done from a process point of view get done in the right order and to the level that is acceptable to the organization. So, things like, process and product quality assurance. They've got some hooks. So remotely safe is probably okay. We get to things like organizational training, and what we hear in terms of safe is crickets. There are SAFe 4.0, which is the newest version of SAFe, 4.x at this point actually, does mention and talks about things like community of practice as knowledge sharing devices. And frankly, I am a big proponent of this whole idea of community of practice, but it's not the same as ensuring that you are building and you have strategic training needs, you've identified those, and that you're actually providing the training to get people there so that your workforce isn't one and done. So there's the Agile, safe, there's very little there. So I would suggest that's blind. If I were doing large-scale work and I was going to keep this team together or these teams of teams because it is a product, that becomes very important to continue that kind of a discussion. Organizational process discussion. So again, arguably you can go out to Scaled Agile and the Scaled Agile Academy, all of those kinds of sites, and actually pull up a nice glossy version of the SAFe framework where you can you can find any number of different pictures that describe Scrum. So arguably, we have some process assets that are defined, but they're defined at sort of this 50,000-foot level, or they're proprietary, and in reality, as practitioners, we all recognize the absolute need to inspect and adapt, that we have to take something, try it out, use it, and then form it to how we do the work. That discussion really doesn't happen in SAFe, and arguably it doesn't happen in most frameworks directly. So we have to have a mechanism for that. I would suggest that that's something to borrow from out of the CMMI, sort of the organization process. Establish our organization process assets so that people know where they are and understand how to maintain them over some period of time. So again, we hear crickets when it comes to that when we think about SAFe. SAFe, again, we can continue to think about this. We can spin it down to a different level. We can take apart the process goals that are part of the CMMI and say, okay, are these covered in SAFe, and do we care, right? That actually becomes a very interesting part of the discussion. Agile suggests that we need not only to inspect and adapt, but we have to challenge and think about what we're doing so that we actually do it in the most effective manner possible. We can then spin this discussion down to even a lower level, right? We can look at things in the CMMI and say, you know what, CMMI says that one needs a project schedule. Well, lo and behold, most Agile teams would not have a Microsoft project schedule, but they would have, if you're SAFe, right, you'd have a program increment. You might have a sprint backlog kind of thing. You might have a road map if you were looking at sort of the value stream level. Here's how this product is going to evolve. I work with a number of product teams, right? They actually are delivering and have a sense of a product, and they can tell you with fair degree of certainty the features that they'll deliver in the next couple of quarters, perhaps the next couple of releases if they're doing it that way. But when they come to, a year from now, or perhaps even further out, they get into what I would call more closely akin to glittering generalities. But they have these kinds of things. We have mechanisms that supplant and actually provide better feedback than the classic project schedule. The CMMI calls out the whole idea of a risk register, whereas in SAFe, those risks end up on the backlog. They get roamed during the program increment planning. Because they're backlog items, they get looked at and groomed as the teams move forward in terms of taking work in every 2 weeks if they're on a 2-week cadence. So there's a lot of substantial risk management going on. So we can say, okay, risk register, that's an important concept. Here's how we can instantiate it in a better way as we move forward. And we can go down the list. I mean, there are some where they're just, the SAFe doesn't deal with them. Things like that technical data package at the bottom here. Arguably, the same thing would be true if we talked about a strategic sort of view of organizational training. Again, those aren't deliverables that we have called out and SAFe. The question I have for you is whether or not you need those. If you are working to deliver a product, then the answer probably is, at least for the organizational training, the evolution, the roadmaps. Of course you need those kinds of things. They're not just standard throwaway kind of deliverables that one might have for a project. So overall, if we, as I said, there are 25 process areas in the software CMMI, the dev for dev. There are some of them that are pretty safe, right? We looked at project planning, requirements development. There are risk management. They're all, we have a high degree of coverage. As we back off of that, we get down the list where we get into the organizational program management, the process, the organizational training, those sorts of things. We get to a point where the answer is those things aren't talked about in SAFe. They're not talked about in Scrum. They're not part of Extreme. They're not part of Kanban as a rule. So we then have to step back and say, okay, not there. The question then becomes, do we want them there? What's important to the organization? What value do they have? And then we can, if they're needed, we can start to think about how we incorporate them in. I go back to that whole discussion that we had on the slide that had the Lean and Agile principles. We can leverage those to determine how we would integrate those into. So again, I would suggest that the CMMI SAFe are highly compatible. They're highly compatible if we want them to be highly compatible. There's no reason why CMMI has to be the boat anchor that many of us have seen implemented in the world, because that's really, there's nowhere in that model that says it. So we can leverage that as a model. We can look at the ideas and concepts that are identified and then harvest them to harden, to augment the way we're doing work. And that's true whether or not we're doing just plain old Scrum, Kanban, or something, a much larger framework like SAFe. These are models. CMMI is a model. We can use frameworks to fill in that model, to fill in those holes. We can find the gaps. The real crux of any of this is to identify the gaps and determine whether or not filling that gap will be of higher value to us than leaving it empty. People do this, and so this isn't just a theoretical conversation. There are organizations like CCH Canadian that were combining the CMMI for Dev software at maturity level 2 and at the same time leveraging SAFe, so that they were using bits and pieces and using, finding the gaps and filling those holes in. There are organizations that have done this at maturity level 4, all the way up to level 5 now. It's a tool. These are all just tools. The goal out of any of this isn't to be safe, right? Isn't just to be, CMMI level 5. Our goal really is to deliver the most value humanly possible. So I like these kinds of quotes. I like this sort of the idea of barely sufficient is too much. From Jim Highsmith. We, I think, have to challenge that barely sufficient philosophy. We have to decide as our own practitioners what really must we do, and then do it in the simplest way possible. But we can't just say barely sufficient is too much, cut it down even further. It's about asking the questions, not just plugging the holes. And I think many of us, if we rented an apartment back in the university days and put up posters, even though we weren't supposed to, learned very quickly that we could take toothpaste and fill the hole. Well, I don't think that's the way we want to work in terms of delivering software. Our goal, obviously, is to make a choice about how we want to fill the hole, whether or not we want to use spackling paste or toothpaste, and then understand the consequences of both. CMMI is not agile or not, is not agile or it isn't agile, right? So it's neither agile or not agile. It's a model. We then take frameworks. We then take techniques, things like SAFe, things like Scrum, things like extreme programming, Kanban, and we use those to fill in those gaps so that, very frankly, we can get to a point where we deliver value. It's all about the gaps. So I think it's time for some questions.
Perfect timing there, Tom. While we're waiting for some questions here, is there any like one or two specific questions that you might get typically when giving this presentation while we're trying to wait for some questions here?
Well, as they come in, so it depends on the audience, right? But one of the ones that typically pop up is we do Scrum, we do Kanban, but that doesn't really talk at all about technical practices. And that's, again, this is where I think it is important to think about and look at the CMMI level 5, which start to call out technical practices, which drive us back to a discussion of that happened very early, actually slightly predates the whole Agile movement, and that is the idea of extreme programming. which says, you know what, we have to do things like test-driven development, which means that we integrate testing in. We need to think about things like continuous integration, continuous builds, those sorts of things. It gets us to a point where we've combined things like coding, things like testing, things like implementing DevOps kind of stuff, and says, you know what, that has to be part and parcel of the Agile picture. So that's one, and that says if you're thinking Agile, think broader than just Scrum. Just Scrum isn't generally is a great way to start, good for project management, but doesn't talk technical practices. So that's one. Have any popped in yet?
Yes, there are a couple there for you.
Okay.
Do you see those on the question box there?
No.
No. All right. I'll just read them off to you here. One person is asking, isn't SAFe a development method for projects and programs, while CMMI is an organizational development framework, especially at level 3 and above?
CMMI is definitely a framework. It is definitely a framework that can be applied at the organizational level. That's why it talks to things like training and things like that. But again, because of the way it's been applied, CMMI gets applied to program level work. Program level work is just exactly the target audience that people have for the Scaled Agile Framework. And the word development, and that might be sort of a word that you would unpack, but SAFe is a mechanism for understanding and driving work down from a portfolio level. What work should we do as an organization, whatever that portfolio is? What order should we do it? And then gets into the nuts and bolts of technical. So I think both of them can be construed to be organizational in nature.
Okay, next one here's one wants to just get your thoughts on CMMI appraisal needs to revise in light of SAFe.
Having been through a couple of appraisals that were against SAFe organizations, there really isn't a whole lot of tailoring. Arguably one of the things to do early on is to ensure that whomever your lead appraiser is, that they understand the relationships between the CMMI model and the framework of SAFe, and how they overlap, and what areas, like I showed you on a couple of slides, what areas should suffice, if done correctly, should suffice to have coverage within the model. So I would have that discussion earlier on. As you get into the appraisal process, again, it's it's about getting evidence that you're actually doing what you say you're going to do.
Okay, next one here is how to assess the SAFe for organization like we assess the CMMI for organization by external assessments.
SAFe as a Scaled Agile doesn't have a appraisal methodology, so you're not going to go out and get an organization that appraises you and says thou art safe. There are numerous organizations that will have a conversation with you, including my own, about looking at and assessing your Agile practices and giving you feedback on them from an external practice point of view. Again, feedback I would say is one of the most important thing any organization can get, because that then allows them to grow. But it isn't to get a maturity level badge kind of thing. So it's a little different in that case.
Wonderful. Well, that's all the questions that we have today. So I'd like to thank you, Tom, for your time today, and thank everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you again, Tom.
My pleasure, Eric. Thanks for everyone who attended.